My name is Barry Judd. For people who don't know, I'm Professor Indigenous Social Research here at Alice Springs, and at the minute I'm also acting PVC Indigenous Leadership for Charles Darwin University. Welcome to this PPP seminar of the Northern Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Peter Ridoll, who is Dean for the Office of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership and Strategy, University of Canberra. Peter is a descendant of the Anaiwan people of New South Wales and has extensive experience in Indigenous higher education over a long period of time now, Peter. We've known each other probably going back to maybe the 1990s. And I have to say, Peter is one of the people in the sector and in the Indigenous space that I really look up to and respect. His work at the University of Canberra has been outstanding. Anybody who's followed the media on Indigenous higher education development would know that Peter's been kicking goals here, there and everywhere and leaving many of us wondering how he's doing it all. I think one of the reasons for my admiration of Peter is that, like myself, he comes from a working class background, and for the first period of his working life, Peter was a motor mechanic. So he has a real understanding, I think, of how education can transform the lives of individuals and communities, and that's especially acute for Indigenous people as we seek to close the gap in government speed around education, employment and a whole range of social and economic indicators. I think today is important, and it really follows on from some issues and themes that we've been raising here in Alice Springs through some recent symposiums and previous presentations by people around our ability to influence and shape government policy that impacts the Northern Territory as people who live here. And as a research group in Central Australia, we've been talking up the idea that the best research and the best advice to government comes from people who actually live and know the context in which we're operating. But we're a very small group, and the reality is that government policy and programs continues to be overwhelmingly shaped by people from that other territory who fly in and out of places like Alice Springs, and whose ideas of what it means to live in this context or in a remote community context is, I think, limited, because you don't get a deep understanding of things like remoteness. If you leave Canberra in the morning, you're here in Alice Springs by the afternoon, and you're back in Canberra by midday the next day. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, Peter. I spent the weekend with Peter camping, so Peter himself may have a better idea of what remoteness means and how lousy some of our roads are after the weekend, and the attitude of local Centralians to people from the ACT. But I'll let him explain what we learned from doing some shopping in town. Welcome to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barry. And it's funny, and thanks to those kind words, I've known each other for quite a while, and higher education has definitely taken a different turn in the as you become more senior, you realise just how, I suppose, the competing interests are and how challenging that is. I just want to first acknowledge the Aboriginal people on which lands we're meeting on today and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and also acknowledge both Judy and Professor Barry Judd for the invitation to come and speak today. I can't tell you what happened on the camping trip, unfortunately, but I'd love to explain that, but won't. So it was a fabulous trip. It's not the first time I've been to the Northern Territory, but I'll explain that as I go along. Today I'm going to talk about is Canberra the centre? And reality is, of course it is, we all know it is, right? I'm joking, of course. I'm joking, of course. I remember my auntie ringing me and saying, I'm not happy with John Howard. I just moved to Canberra. The phone had rang on my new number, and she said, nephew, I'm really upset about what John Howard is doing to Aboriginal people. Can you go tell him that I don't like what he's doing? And she was really upset. And of course, I thought she was joking, but she was deadly sincere. She was sincere. She thought we could wander over and see him. Of course, I laughed, because I thought she was joking, and then I realised I had offended her. Just as tourists think that kangaroos hop down our streets and we can catch them, my auntie had thought that politicians walk around Canberra and we could actually approach them. But as I learned, in Canberra, actually nobody goes hungry. Too much kangaroo tail, for me. I've lived in Canberra now for over 20 years, and please forgive me for that. And it's given me a great insight into the perceptions of Australia. I call Canberra a small piece of non-Australia. It's a part of the country where Indigenous outcomes are so overinflated. We a lot of Aboriginal people, people own houses, got the best education outcomes, the best incomes, the largest home ownership. And if we have one homicide a year in Canberra, it's devastating. In fact, we had one this year. It's pretty bad. Last year we didn't have any, but one this year is terrible. It's a safe place. Before I moved to Canberra, I was living in Taree. Nowadays, of course, it is a sleepy town on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. It is known for its large Aboriginal population and its social challenges. But less so for the race riots in 1974. Not so sleepy then. I was a motor mechanic at the time, working at a place called Hart's Auto House. I just want to quickly show a photo of this lovely, very young person up here. And I just want to acknowledge there was a lovely man who recently passed, just a couple of months ago. I just want to acknowledge his generosity and patience with his shared knowledge, telling me all he knew about cars. As we know, there's always knowledge transfer in any industry, particularly, and he was Yugoslavian, so he wasn't the most, didn't nuance conversations very much, so. Reflecting on what I thought about Canberra before I moved to Canberra. So I thought Canberra was the centre of power. I honestly did. A place where politicians resided and where they make decisions for us mere mortals. And the misconception by my aunt that I would just wander down Canberra streets and bump into a politician. As it turns out, it's quite hard to do actually, unless you visit Parliament House or Kingston Hotel. Kingston Hotel on sitting weeks, then it's quite hard to find a politician anywhere. Even if you go to the Parliament House, it's very unlikely you'll see one. But just recently, as Barry sort of alluded to, I did get a bit of an insight into what Alice Springs locals think of Canberra. Barry and I walked into a shop. I was being a bit facetious because I wanted to get a bit of reaction so I could see what they thought. So I said, welcome to my staffer is going to buy it, welcome me, and I said, hello, so I'm from the other territory, the important one. That went down so well, I can tell you. And he said, oh, where the idiots and parasites are. I thought, oh, that's great. Perhaps I shouldn't have thought that. Idiots and parasites. It's a very interesting notion. Of course, unless you live there, you wouldn't realise just how beautiful the place is and how likely it is that politicians are only there for a few weeks a year, they're not there all the time. As my children grew up in Canberra, I would take them to question time in Parliament House. They got to see grown men and women arguing quite loudly across the chamber. On television, you don't get to see the fullness of all that arguing and yelling going on because only one microphone is turned on at any one time, so you only get the background. You don't get to see the roaring and the craziness that goes on. Of course, it's all a bit of a game for the politicians because what they want is a 5-second grab on their evening news, so they may get more notoriety, so they get to know them, so they're shoring up their voter base. However, try to explain to your children, who are very young, that this is our democracy at work. It's very tricky. Recently, I was discussing the flaws, and I want to show this slide. Recently, I was discussing the flaws in what we call our representative democracy. Hopefully we know there's two houses of parliament, right? The green one and the maroon one. And it's not Queensland. The House of Representatives and the Senate. Our system of government was created with the idea that the House of Representatives would represent us at the local level of what we call federal elections. There's probably at least two in the territory. And the Senate would be the House of Review. So anything that the government would actually produce in terms of policy would come to the Senate, and the Senate would review that. The idea of the Senate was to actually, for those who don't know, the idea of the Senate wasn't to be a party house like it is now. It was meant to actually be a state or territory house, to actually go into bat for your state or territory issues. But of course, because we had a two-party system, that didn't work that way. Australia has 6 states and 10 territories. I didn't know we had 10 territories, to be honest. But we do, we have 10 territories. Today I'm going to talk about 3 of those territories, namely the Northern Territory, ACT, and Australia and Norfolk Island. I want to talk Norfolk Island because it's quite an interesting parallel with Norfolk. In our Parliament, we have 150 members in the House of Representatives who represent us, and 76 senators. You see that each of the 6 states on this slide here, each of the 6 states have 12 senators each. Yet the territories have just 2. The populations, if you like, are there as well. You can see the Tasmania, ACT, Northern Territory. But what's interesting is Tasmania. But let's reflect on this for a moment. So Australia became a federated in 1901. We know that, but do we know why? Canberra was built, the physical capital Canberra was built as both Sydney and Melbourne wanted to be the capital, so of course there's always compromise. So politicians, our founding, what I call the colonial founding fathers, all men by the way, not a lot of women in this space at this time, decided the capital was between the 2 cities. It was quite deliberate. And of course our constitution came into existence through the Commonwealth of Australia Act, which was passed through the British Parliament. There's lots of reasons put forward to federate, representing a united front on immigration, having the same width rail tracks before federation. There were 3 different rail track sizes in Australia. You couldn't travel between New South Wales and Victoria without having to change at the border. Very interesting. Of course, this is protectionist time, right? Looking after the colonial outposts, if you like, looking after our own interests. Of course, probably the most important reasons were defence and also so the federal government could actually collect our taxes to pay for defence. The Australian historian John Hirst, when asked about the Federation, he stated there was a very mixed bag of people who voted or campaigned for no in the referendums leading up to Federation. There were three, one in 1898, one in 1999, and then in 2000. And then there were those who thought that the provinces or colonies would be endangered by Federation, either economically or politically. They would lose their political power. There were those who thought that the immediate economic interests, such as jobs in their local region, were being threatened. And there were those who were in favour of a union of some sort, but thought the model was wrong. Particularly the Democrats in New South Wales and Victoria, who wanted a more democratic union, by which they meant is to not have such a strong Senate, because having 12 senators has skewed the political power towards the states. It is my belief that this is where we went wrong. If we wanted true representation, we should have built into the Constitution equal Senate representation for all states and territories, so they could have equal power. And by now, the situation is that the states have all the power, and most of the states are on the East Coast. Most of the states are on the East Coast. But there's one territory that I want to touch on that's a little bit odd. So the Norfolk Island has an interesting governance arrangements, and there's two reasons why. One is that there was a terrible, difficult time for the economy when the GST was brought in. For those who don't know, Norfolk Island was the cheapest place in the world to buy Lego before the GST came in. And then we put Australian taxes. It's true. My mother-in-law would travel there regularly and come back with lots of Lego for the kids. It's fabulous. And the other one that was had a big impact on their economy was there was a global financial crisis. So they reached out to Australia and asked them. Before that, they were governed on their own, had their own economy, they were self-funded. Before those two events, completely self-funded. Unfortunately, because of those two events, they reached out to Australia and said, can we have your economic support? Can you underwrite us for this economic stuff that's happened to us, this terrible stuff that's happened to us? And Australia said, yes, but. So on the 1st of July, 2016, a regional council imposed by Australia's federal government took over the local council responsibilities for things such as roads, rates and rubbish. Norfolk Islanders, get this, Norfolk Islanders now vote in the Australia's federal elections, but they vote for one senator in the Australian Capital Territory to represent them. Yet, they are under New South Wales laws. Does that make any sense? At all. But yet, how many people would know that? I have to say that Central Australia has an attraction like no other place in the country. But it's hard to get the people to come out here and stay more than just a few hours. In 2005, I was very lucky to do, like everybody else does, come for a little bit and bugger off. In 2005, I lived at Northern Jubilee for just over 3 months, doing my PhD fieldwork, looking at how communities, particularly Aboriginal households, use information and technology. And don't forget, this is a time before the smartphone. Does anyone know when the iPhone came to be or in Australia? The first iPhone. Does anyone remember when the first iPhone was sold in Australia? 07, very good. Yeah, in 2007. And of course, after Facebook was around in 2004, but because smartphones, the proliferation of smartphones, that's when Facebook was taken up more regularly. I remember bringing my eldest son out to Mutijulu for a week while I was out there. He was lucky enough to go hunting and spend time in the community with other kids his age. He was about 16 or 15 or 16. An impressionable time, of course. Had a profound impact on him for that week. So much so that when he graduated university, mind you, like his dad, he spent time being a tradie before going to university, but once he graduated in psychology, the first thing he wanted to do was make a difference to the world. He wanted to actually change the world for Aboriginal kids, so he thought that he put his good education to use in the area of child protection at Mount Isa, which, if anyone works in child protection, even though his dad guided him away from that, he felt like he could make a difference. Now he's moved into, still on his crusade to make the world a better place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, he now works for a non-government organisation in restorative practice. And he says, much better to do the preventative stuff than actually do the child protection, because it was just such a draining experience on him. I think it's hard to make policy for a community of all people that you don't know. I think it's really hard to do that. The federal government doesn't engage in any meaningful way in remote Australia unless there's significant economic interest to the country. I think that is partly because there are few votes in such places. There are very few votes in such places. I think it's also because most politicians don't understand remote communities, and I don't think they understand the Aboriginal people that live in these remote communities. So how you view your world is important in terms of the context, and Barry's will touch on this already a little bit. But I want to give you a couple of examples, at least one example. In Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, he talks about the Rewara fish traps in New South Wales. Now these fish traps are the oldest man-made structure on this planet. Not that most Australians will recognise that. In his book, he recounts verbatim from the colonialist John Kirby's diaries. I use this to demonstrate that context and perspective is very important when you're creating policy. Kirby went on to witness an Aboriginal man using great ingenuity and engineering to fish, but he saw it a little bit different to that. And I'm going to quote from Bruce's book, and this is from Kirby's diary. A black would sit near the opening, and just behind him, a tough stick, about 10 feet long, was stuck in the ground, the thick end down. To the thin end of the rod was attached a line with a noose at the other end. A wooden peg was fixed under the water at the opening in the fence, to which the noose was caught. And when the fish made a dart to go through the opening, he would be caught by the gills. His force undid the loop from the peg, and the spring of the stick threw the fish over the head of the black, who would then, in a most lazy manner, reach back his hand, undo the fish, set the loop again around the peg. So perspective is everything, and understanding the context is everything. Note Kirby used the words lazy and didn't at all describe the ingenuity or engineering that was going on in that space at all. And this is incredibly fabulous. Who wouldn't want to fish that way? Whoop, got the fish away. Who wouldn't do that? This is ingenuity at its greatest. Yet he saw it as lazy, in the most lazy way. No, nothing about the engineering. So I wonder why. Was there a prejudice against Aboriginal people? Or perhaps he had no understanding of what he was really witnessing, or understanding the concept, the context. So how do we get politicians to engage in remote and rural communities, but in any context, but particularly in the Aboriginal space? Well, we all know it's very difficult, right? But there's one thing I do know, that things have changed out this way, for whatever reason. So the PM now, our Prime Minister, has been to the Northern Territory twice this year. Twice. And our previous Prime Minister worked in the Aboriginal community, lived in the Aboriginal community for a week, once a year. But our Prime Minister's last visit to the Central Australia was probably for an interesting reason, and most of you might know, because even I saw it in the southern states in Canberra watching the news. It was always one person standing alongside of him the whole time. So perhaps Warren Snowden's in a bit of bother at the next election. Perhaps a change of the guard will happen because Jacinta Price was there. So perhaps he was here to promote her in the federal election, and she has got traction, there's no doubt about that, in the Northern Territory. Or perhaps he was here to stitch up some business deals, who knows? Perhaps both. Perhaps there is an election at the end of this year. I'll get cynics so product for this. So turning to policy making and gaining traction in the Northern Territory, I don't think I have ever won an argument on purely on equity basis. I worked in Indigenous higher education for a very long time. If I walked into my boss's office and said, you have to do this because it's an equity issue, often the answer was no. I couldn't win that. Or I walk into the office and say, we're the traditional owners of the country, you're here on our land, and you just acknowledge that just a few moments ago at the opening, so can I get some more resources for our students or more resources for research? The answer is no. So what I have to do, and somehow we all have to do this, is create a business case. We have to create a business case. So some of you might know there's some amazingly very capable, wonderful Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the public service who are bureaucrats, who work very hard to try and explain to the secretaries and to the ministers, if they should get such lucky to actually speak with the ministers. But the context is what we have to do in Australia. This is what we have to do to actually address this. Often that's not the case. They don't get the chance to actually talk to the politicians. What they do is they just do the best they can in very difficult circumstances, hoping that they get a little bit of traction. They don't always. So turning to policy making, what we do know, but what we also know is that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have gone to the United Nations and embarrassed and ashamed Australia for the human rights record, right? And particularly in the Northern Territory. Has that made a difference? Not a bit. Not a bit. So I say the business case is important. I don't think you can have one Indigenous policy either, by the way. Something that some of my colleagues who are bureaucrats in Canberra talk about, we have dinner and catch up regularly, is that there seems to be a push for one Indigenous policy. But you really need to be contextualised. So I think you have to actually not only contextualise it, but you've got to have the community as part of actually the solution to come up with that policy. Perhaps that's a little bit progressive for some. If you don't understand the context, and particularly in remote and very remote communities, how on earth do you envisage the policy being implemented? How can you envisage something being implemented if you don't understand the context? So what governments want? So what do governments want, particularly at this moment? The Conservative governments, they want a good business case. They want to see that there is some give and take. They want to see there's value for money. They want to see some reform or change in exchange for more resources. We won't win by saying it's the right thing to do. We won't win by arguing it's our right, it's our birthright. Because that's a wash. Okay, so just to sum up, I think there are a few points to get government to engage in rural and remote communities. I think before politicians, or others for that matter, consider policy, they need to visit the community where it's going to be implemented. It's not a big deal. It's not going to take forever. And there's lots of days. But come up and have a look at the context. You cannot cure something if you don't understand it. And coming up, as Barry said, coming up on a plane in the morning and then next day back in Canberra by midday, you're not going to understand the context. You're not going to understand it. The other thing is, wouldn't it be great if the Northern Territory had 12 senators? There'd be a bit of a focus on the NT rather than Tasmania all the time. Why does Tasmania get the lion's share of resources? They have a lot more crossbenchers in Tasmania, so they can negotiate with the senators in Tasmania, often get legislation through. To do that, they go, give us more NBN, give us more this, more that. The resources that Tasmania have gotten through their senators is incredible. I think, again, push the point about the business case, you need to give something else, give and take. In the absence of 12 senators, you need something to trade in exchange for more resources. If I can just finish with this and say, tell John Howard, if you ever see him, tell him that my auntie is still very upset and she wants to talk to him. Thank you.